Hey, welcome back. Another episode of the Good Advice Podcast. We got a lot to talk about today. Some news happening with Good Advice. Not necessarily Good Advice the business, but I want to talk about this new business we got called Podcastable. All that and more is on the show today and what it means for current customers of Good Advice. More importantly, if you like podcasting, which you like it, I guess, a little bit to be listening to the show today. But if you ever thought about starting your own show, or if you're already running your own show today, I think you're going to be really interested in what's happening over in Good Advice world. All that to say, thank you for listening today. You're checking out the best place to learn how to grow and scale your business. And I'm your humble host, here to lead you along the way and at least not give you bad advice, right? It may not be great advice, but it's definitely going to be good advice. And more importantly, being totally serious, it's going to be actionable, practical advice that you can count on. Before we dive into our episode today, we do have a word from one of the amazing businesses that sponsor the podcast. Take a listen to this quick ad, and we'll be right back soon. There's one single piece of advice that I give to business owners who are ready to scale their business drastically. And that's knowing exactly what you need to hand off so that you can continue focusing on what you're an expert in. It amazes me when I talk to business owners who are doing their own bookkeeping and tax prep, and worse, that they're going through all this paperwork at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, even midnight, slaving away trying to make sense of all of the numbers for their business. Business owners who are making it happen have already figured out that you can't do it all yourself. That's why I recommend Steve Lay with Equity Business Solutions. Not only is he an expert in bookkeeping and tax prep, but what I love about Steve is that he'll sit down with you and help you make sense of the value of your business beyond just reading a spreadsheet. You'll be able to make better decisions, and more importantly, you're going to save yourself the crucial time you would have spent going through QuickBooks or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is that keeps us up late at night. So save yourself some time and some money by giving Steve Lay a call at Equity Business Solutions, and he'll show you the value beyond your numbers. Go to equitybusinesssolutionsllc.com to find out more. So today was a big day for Good Advice and the Good Advice brand. I call it a big day because we had some pretty big developments. We launched a new business called Podcastable today. And I want to talk a little bit about why this happened, why we went this route, and more importantly, what does it mean for what are the takeaways for you in your business? I want to help expose some of the thinking that I had along the way, and it might be that it alleviates maybe some of the pain that you might be feeling in your business as well. So the quick and dirty of it is this morning, I basically pushed send on a new business that I'm running called Podcastable. And if you haven't put it together yet, it is a podcast business. It's everything podcast related. Essentially, it's a business that launches and grows podcasts. And we don't do any kind of studio work. We're not going to do I'm not going to go like rent a studio or anything like that. I'm totally disinterested in all that stuff. But it's entirely focused around the podcast editing process, and creating content from your podcasts. And for the people who haven't necessarily started their podcast yet, it's a podcast consultancy to help teach people what needs to happen for them to successfully launch their business. So that's it, from a nitty-gritty standpoint. Let's back up around 2 years ago as to why I started this business. Like, why did this happen? And I'll go ahead and say also too, just like some questions that I've received today from a variety, and it's actually kind of funny. I expected to kind of launch the business and no one would care. And funny enough, I've gotten some really encouraging messages and people who've reached out and people who've been very kind to leave me a business review and a Google review, which, by the way, if you listen to the podcast, I would so appreciate a Google review either on my Good Advice business page or on my new Podcastable business page. That would really be helpful, especially if you've really liked the podcast, if you found some insights from it. That'd be a really great gesture you could do. But besides the point, let's go back a couple of years. Okay. So I've been doing the podcast for about 5.5 years now. We have over 400 episodes. The podcast has grown tremendously. I think about how running a business really has its highs and lows in the sense of you have some months that are incredible, some months that are not incredible. I had a month in February that was literally insane for me in terms of revenue. And I just thought, like, this is crazy. And then the month before that, in January, there was like nothing that happened. It was one of my worst months since last summer. So the highs and lows, this just happens in business. You have your feast and famine. You have these moments where things are going well, things are not going well. And by the way, that's a whole separate point about curating your pipeline, always be selling, always be closing, thinking about your next deal. It's why a lot of times when businesses are scaling, it's important for the business owner to hire on and outsource some of the more mundane tasks, or mundane isn't necessarily the right word, but like it's important as a business grows for the business owner to really elevate into a status that's around brand identity and is focused on the brand equity. And they're thinking about the big picture strategic decisions about the business. They're thinking about the business's marketing and who knows about them and who's, what's the next big decision for the business. It's hard to do that when you're in the business every day doing the actual work. So point being, there's always these really big moments and not great moments that can happen when you're running a business. Well, the exception to this would be the podcast. I was on a phone call with someone the other day, and actually it was probably about 6 months ago. And they were asking about the show. And I was like, yeah, it's kind of a weird deal. In 5 years, the podcast has never had that downturn moment. I mean, there's been months where like some months are better than other months. There's definite, like I had a day the other day where we had 500 downloads in the day. And I thought, wow, this is a lot of downloads for the podcast. Point being though, the podcast itself has just always just done well. It's just always improved. And, every month brings new listeners. Every month brings really positive comments. And more importantly, I guess it was a little over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, where I started monetizing the podcast. And that's been incredible. But about 2 years ago, somebody reached out to me and they said, hey, I want to start a podcast. And I said, okay, cool. And they said, would you teach me how to start a podcast? And if so, what would you charge? Now, I had no idea what I would charge. I was like, I don't know. What would I charge? I have no clue. So I was like, $500 and I'll teach you how to do it. And this guy was like, okay. And I was like, oh, and then that led to a referral and someone else reaching out, and kind of that's kind of how the story goes, right? Is, one person leads to another person. Well, then I had someone reach out who I'd never met before. I didn't even know this person at all. And it was the same thing. It was, hey, what would you charge to help me to start my podcast? And I said $500. And they were like, oh, wow, you're way lower than this other company, which was charging $2,500, which, by the way, guys, if someone tells you you're way cheaper than a competitor, that's not necessarily like a badge of honor. It's not necessarily like wow, look at me. Often these things work against you more than they provide value to the customer, just because of there's so much that goes in play in terms of like perceived brand value. Well, so then that led to another situation where someone was like, hey, we were talking about, they were talking about starting a podcast. They had reached out. They said, hey, what would you charge? And I said, hey, this is what I do. It's $500 to teach you how to start it. And the person was like, well, what would you charge me to just do it? I was like, what do you mean? They're like, what would you charge just to do it for me? And so I threw out a big number. It was a big number. And I was like, probably this much. And they were like, and literally the same thing happened. They go, okay. And I was stunned. I mean, this was an amount that kind of threw, I mean, it wasn't like that much, honestly, but it was way higher than and actually it was like it was higher than what I typically charge for my consulting services. That's what actually kind of threw me, was I was like, wow, okay. And then once I got more of those customers and the rates, I started increasing my rates, and like it was just interesting. I was on a sales call with someone. I got connected with the largest, I think it's the largest AV company in Melbourne, and they were looking for someone to do their podcasts. And like we were on a call, it was half an hour long, or maybe it was like an hour, I can't remember, but it was like a very easy like chatting conversation. And then they're like, all right, sounds good, let's work together. And point being, here's what I want to get at. There's an interesting insight here about not realizing your skill sets and how those can be monetized into like starting a business. But I just kept seeing momentum around this service to the point where I was like, man, this is something interesting. And if you've listened to the podcast long term, and it's funny, I never actually expected this to happen to me, but if you've listened to the podcast long term, you've heard me tell stories about innovation and leaning into like when a customer says like, ooh, I really like that feature. I really like that you do that. I'm really interested in that. And being willing to pull on that thread and pivot the business and innovate the business to take advantage of that thing. And that's really what these last few months have been like. One thing that's true for me is I'm a big fan of simplicity in business, simplicity around brand. I'm a big fan of having a really clear offer for your business. I'm a big fan of your niche. Like in the consulting world, I try to really avoid being, I'm a business consultant. For any problem you have, I'll help you. That's not me. I'm a big fan of advising people to really hone in on who is your buyer and what do they buy from you, and being absolutely critically clear about that. I'm in those kinds of conversations with my customers often. We're talking about doing that often and really not avoiding brand confusion, and not even brand confusion, but like simplifying your process where it doesn't feel clunky and it doesn't feel awkward, like in the sales process. And you're like, well, yeah, we can do this and we can do that too. And yeah, here's all the things we do. And because how people typically buy in general is the simpler and cleaner your business feels to them, the more perceived value that they have for you. And this is a little counterintuitive because a lot of times people think the more complicated you make it, the more credible you seem, and the more likely they will be to buy from you because you're so smart about what you do. And in reality, it actually does the opposite thing. When you start talking about complications and here's all the things that have to happen, I need to make sure you understand this or that, you need to understand that customers, when it feels complicated, they typically back away and they typically go with someone else. So the next time you're explaining something or going into detail, you want to keep it as simple as possible. It doesn't mean you can't leverage your expertise. I've had people who've called me in the past and they've said, hey, Blake, I really want this to happen for my business. And I realize they have a misconception about their business. Or, one funny example, I've given this 1,000 times, the person who called and said, hey, I want to pay less than minimum wage. Well, this person has a fundamental misunderstanding of how minimum wage works. So I'm not going to let's keep it simple. No, it's, hey, we need to take a second and understand this a little bit better to get on the same page. But beyond that, I think a lot of times, especially like people selling a certain service or a product or whatever, they really over manage the whole thing with their customers. At the end of the day, think of it this way. If you're a TV salesperson if you sell like a flat screen TV, does your customer really care how the TV works? More importantly, can you tell me how your TV works? Do you know how your computer works? Do you know how, now we're talking about technology here, right? But like, even I had a guy who came, he knocked on my door. He was selling a service to mow my lawn. And I got this funny conversation where he knocked on the door, and please don't knock on my door, by the way. But I will say, if you do knock on my door, I at least try to give someone the time of day because I know sales is tough. So he knocks on my door. I said, "Hey, how's it going?" He said, "Hey, I'd love to cut your lawn." And I said, "Okay, well, what's your rate? Tell me about it." And he's like, "Well, let's take a look at your lawn first," which I was like, "Okay, it's a pretty basic lawn. We don't got anything fancy going on. It's a basic lawn." So we go out, we walk around, he's looking around, and then he gives me like the stack of features. He's like, "Hey, we're going to mow, we're going to weed eat, we're going to get in these corners, we're going to do this, we're going to do that," to the point where it was too much. It was too much info. To the point where I was kind of like, "Hey man, I kind of know what, I did it. My dad made me do it every 2 weeks, all the years I was growing up." I guess because I don't know why my younger brother never had to do this, by the way, but I definitely got the raw deal because there was a point that my older brother like passed it on to me, and then it was just stuck with me. I think until like I graduated high school or something. I can't remember. But point being, I really don't need the explanation of how a lawn mower works. I get how it works, or I get the result of what it does for me. The same thing's true about a television. I really don't care how the insides of a TV works. All I care about is that what it does for me, or the opportunity it creates for me as well. The same thing's true about your service or your product. No one really cares about the product. They just care about their pain being solved. So getting back to the point, I got in this weird situation where I was feeling a deep lack of clarity around the brand of Good Advice. And the way I tried to like make that work was, okay, we will teach you how to scale your business. We'll teach you how to grow your business. And then if you want me to do it for you, and it's a podcast, I will. And it was like such like this weird niche specific thing that was like, yeah, I can grow your business. And by the way, do you have a podcast by chance? It was just like, it was such this weird niche thing to the point where it felt like I was really being pulled in two directions. And what's funny is I was actually at like this kid's birthday. Wasn't my kid's birthday party, but I was at a kid's birthday party with my children. And I was making small talk with someone else who's another agency owner. And we were talking about this customer I had who was doing some podcast work with me, and how the customer, it had gone really well. And this is what the customer had paid. And she was like, it kind of sounds like you're a podcast agency now, like kind of joking, like, wow, that's definitely like a healthy enough, its own thing for you to be able to do. So anyway, we got to the point where I was like, this is just like, it's two worlds. It's two worlds that I'm trying to force within the same house. And I think it just kind of hit me at some point this last week where I was like, honestly, this would all be so much easier if I could just keep good advice. We keep doing consulting, we keep working with businesses on sales and marketing, and how do you scale this thing? Like, what's the next step for you? And then if I could just have podcasting be its own thing, that would be just really neat and tidy. And more importantly, it's better for the customer. It's better for the customer to come to me and be like, hey, I need podcast services. Great. You need Podcastable. Or, hey, I need help growing my, and in fact, funny enough, there's some interesting crossover there too, where it does make sense, where someone's like, hey, I'm trying to grow my podcast because it's part of my brand. It's part of my business. We have some other pain points. What else do you do that can help with that? So that is what makes sense to me today. It's what feels good today. This doesn't mean literally nothing is changing. Otherwise, I'm not closing down the podcast. I'm not, closing down Good Advice. I had someone reach out and they were like, hey, so are you not doing Good Advice anymore? And I was like, I am. I'm actually doing the exact same work I've been doing this whole time. It's just that now this piece of the pie of my business, the podcasting piece, is under its own brand name. And that's just really the cleanest way to do it. It's the easiest way to do it. And it helps me feel like I can do such a better job of talking about my business when I create those categories. When I post about Podcastable versus when I post about good advice, it just feels better in my mind. So that's what's happening. That's what's going on. There's no other story to it. There's no drama to it or anything else with it. I'm a pretty straightforward guy. So that's pretty much everything that's going on. Because again, I see value in simplicity. I see value in a niche. I see value in making it critically clear what you do, what you sell, and who it's for. So having said that, again, if you love the podcast, I'd love a review to help just get the business going, get the brand awareness going for the business. We already have some amazing customers with it, but obviously I want to grow that. And if you're launching a podcast, reach out to me. If you are running a podcast and you want someone else to handle the editing or creating content for you, if you know me, I'm really big on content creation and posting regularly. One of the perks of using Podcastable is we'll actually cut you custom content from your podcast that you can then share on social media. And it's a pretty generous content package. So a lot of times when you pay another company to do marketing for you or like content for you, they grab like stock images and like just boring stuff, and then they post like once a week, and it does nothing for your business. Which, by the way, this may be the first time you're realizing this. It's a total money pit for your business. With me, we're creating something that's very custom and very valuable for the person that you're trying to reach. So anyway, that's the scoop. That's the story. And like I said, there's nothing else to do with it. So on the show, you're going to hear me talk about, the growth of Podcastable and growing Podcastable and what it's like to be running two businesses when, really, it really is just like running one business still. But if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. My email is blake@goodadvicecoaching.com, or feeling wild, you can email me blake@getpodcastable.com, which is our website, getpodcastable.com. And I appreciate your support. That's all there is to it. Thank you for listening today. And thank you so much to our advertisers and sponsors of the show. Keep this show going, and I so appreciate it. Thank you. Have a great day. See ya.